10 days before the leaves turned brown for the harvest festival, I discovered my daughter was plotting to humiliate me in front of the whole town and then toss me out of my own front door. So I adjusted my strategy. On the final Tuesday of the month, amidst the scent of slow-cooked brisket and expensive bourbon, my daughter called me in a panic. "Where are you?" she demanded. I just chuckled and told her to check the bottom drawer of my roll-top desk. What she found there caused a scream so piercing that the neighbors likely thought the house was coming down. This is my story. My name is Elias Vance. I am 74 years old, and my hands feel like tree bark. They are hands that have mixed mortar, stacked stone, and literally raised the skyline of Charlotte when this city was nothing but potential and dusty roads. But on that Tuesday afternoon, 10 days before a holiday meant for gratitude, those same hands were slick with oil as I tightened a pipe in the crawl space of a house I paid for with 40 years of sweat. I lived there like a ghost in the machine. Before I go further, I want to say that if you have ever been looked down upon by the people you gave everything to, you know exactly how this feels. It is a specific kind of ache that starts in your bones and settles in your spirit. The basement was damp and smelled of old cedar and iron. It was my territory, the only place I was allowed to exist without judgment. Upstairs, the house was a palace of velvet sofas and white carpets. But down here it was just me and the water heater. I was flat on my back, sliding under the sink, trying to kill a leak that my son-in-law, Julian, had griped about that morning. He had snapped his fingers at me as he left for his private equity firm, saying, "Kill that drip, Eli. It's annoying me." He never called me Dad, just Eli. He treated me like a handyman he forgot to pay. I let out a grunt as I wrenched the metal. My joints throbbed with a familiar heavy ache, the price you pay for 4 decades in the trades. I wiped sweat from my forehead with my sleeve, leaving a smudge of grease on my skin. I was just about to pack up my tools when I heard the heavy thud of the front door. Julian's heavy loafers and Maya's sharp heels clicked across the floorboards right above my head. They were home earlier than expected. I froze, not because I was scared, but because I had learned that being invisible was the only way to keep the peace. The vents in this old house were like microphones, carrying every whisper from the parlor directly down to the concrete where I lay. I heard Julian first. His voice was high and tight, the way he spoke when he was trying to sound like the smartest man in the room. "Maya, we need to finalize the guest list for next week. My parents just confirmed. They're flying in from Boston on Wednesday morning, a full day early." I held my breath. I knew the Whitmores. They were the kind of people who smiled with their teeth but looked at you like you were a bug under a glass slide. They treated me as if my presence alone might devalue the property. "That's wonderful, darling," Maya replied, though she sounded nervous. "I'll make sure the East Wing is ready. I bought those silk linens your mother likes." "Maya, you aren't listening," Julian snapped, his voice dropping into a colder, sharper register. "It isn't about the linens. It's about him." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the lungs. I knew who him was. I gripped my wrench until my knuckles turned white. "What about my father?" Maya asked, her voice trembling just a bit. "He can't be here," Julian stated. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a verdict. "Not when my parents are visiting. You know how my mother is about clutter. Having a dusty old man in stained flannels wandering around, mumbling about the old days. It isn't the brand we're building here, Maya. It ruins the image." A sharp pain hit my chest, worse than any physical injury. Dusty. Clutter. A ruin. I looked down at my work clothes. They were stained because I was fixing his sink. They were dirty because I had been up on a ladder cleaning his gutters all morning. "Julian, he lives here," Maya whispered. "Where is he supposed to go? It's the Harvest Festival." "I don't care where he goes," Julian countered. "Put him in a motel. Or better yet, let's stop lying to ourselves. You said you looked into that facility. Oak Haven. Oak Haven." The name felt like a punch to the gut. Everyone in this county knew Oak Haven. It was a state-run warehouse for the forgotten. It was a place where people went to sit in plastic chairs and stare at the wall until their time ran out. It smelled of bleach and abandonment. "Julian, Oak Haven is... It's not a nice place, Maya said, her voice weak. It's what we can afford for him, Julian said dismissively. Look, my parents are coming to celebrate my promotion. They think we're more stable than we are. If they see him shuffling around like a shadow, they won't invest in my new fund. They'll think we're distracted by a burden. He has to go, Maya. Permanently. I waited. I waited for my daughter, the girl I had raised on my own after my wife, Sarah, passed away, to stand up for me. I waited for her to remember the double shifts I worked at the quarry to pay for her law degree. I waited for her to say, "This is my father's house and you're the guest." Instead, I heard a sigh. A long, tired, defeated sound. Okay, Maya said softly. You're right. He is getting more forgetful. Yesterday, he didn't even use a coaster on the mahogany table. I closed my eyes. I hadn't forgotten. Julian had hidden the coasters to make me look senile. I'll make the arrangements, Maya continued. I'll tell him he has a checkup on Monday. We'll drop him at Oak Haven for an evaluation and just leave him. By the time he figures it out, the festival will be over. Perfect, Julian said, the tension leaving his voice. You're doing the right thing for us. Now let's go get dinner. I don't want to be here when he crawls out of the crawl space. Their footsteps faded away toward the kitchen, laughing about which vintage of wine to open. I lay there on the cold floor, the wrench still heavy in my hand. A single tear, hot and furious, tracked through the grease on my face. They weren't just moving me. They were discarding me like trash. They were planning to trick me, abandon me in a hellhole, all to protect a lie. I thought about this house. I had bought this land 30 years ago. I had framed these walls with my own 2 hands. I had put the deed in Maya's name as a gift, but I let them live here for free for years because Julian said he needed to scale his business. I had been their cook, their mechanic, and their janitor, making myself small so they could feel tall. This was my reward. Oak Haven. I sat up slowly. My bones creaked, but my mind was suddenly sharper than a razor. The sadness was gone, replaced by a cold, industrial resolve. It was the same feeling I used to get before a big demolition job. You check the blueprints, you find the load-bearing beams, and you bring it all down at once. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It was an old model, but the recording app worked just fine. I had pressed record the second I heard Julian's voice change. I stopped the recording and saved it. I named the file, The Harvest Plan. I stood up and looked at myself in the small, cracked mirror over the utility sink. Gray hair, tired eyes, a face covered in the dirt of their house. They saw a helpless old man. They saw a resource that had been drained dry. They forgot that before I was a retiree, I was a foreman. I knew how to read a structure. And more importantly, I knew exactly where the cracks were hidden. Maya wanted me gone. Fine. I would leave. But I wouldn't be going to Oak Haven. And when I walked out that door, I was going to take the very foundation of their world with me. I turned on the tap and began to scrub my hands with a bar of industrial soap. I scrubbed until my skin was raw. I was washing away the grease, but I was also washing away the last bit of mercy I had for them. Laugh while you can, I whispered to the ceiling. Because in 10 days, you're going to find out what happens when you push a builder too far. I picked up my toolbox and headed for the stairs. I had work to do. Not plumbing. Demolition. 9 days before the Harvest Festival, the humiliation moved from the quiet of the basement into the main rooms of the house. The air in the home was buzzing with nervous energy because Julian had decided to host an early networking mixer for his colleagues at the private equity firm. He called it a high-level strategic gathering, but I knew exactly what it was. It was a desperate attempt to project a level of wealth he didn't actually have to people who didn't really care about him. Around 4 in the afternoon, while I was in the kitchen trying to make myself a simple sandwich, Julian walked in holding a bundle of white fabric. He threw it at my chest without a word of greeting. It was a white service jacket, the kind waiters wear at old-fashioned country clubs. It smelled faintly of mothballs and long-forgotten closets. "Put this on, Eli," he commanded, checking his reflection in the microwave door and adjusting his expensive silk tie. One of the catering staff called in sick last minute. "I need you to pass the hors d'oeuvres and keep the wine glasses topped off." I looked at the jacket, then back at him. My hands, though aged, were still steady. "I am not a waiter, Julian," I said, keeping my voice low and level. "I am a retired master contractor. I am your father-in-law." Julian turned to me, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You are living under my roof for free, Eli. You eat the food I buy. You use the electricity I pay for. Consider this your rent for the month. And do not speak to the guests unless they speak to you first. We want to keep things professional." I looked over at Maya. My daughter was at the kitchen island, meticulously arranging white lilies in a crystal vase. She heard every single word he said. She paused for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering over a stem, and then she continued as if I wasn't even there. She didn't look at me. She didn't defend me. That silence, that refusal to see me, hurt more than the moth-eaten jacket ever could. "Fine," I said softly. I went to the pantry and pulled the jacket on. It was tight across my shoulders. My arms were built from 40 years of lifting heavy lumber and swinging hammers, not serving delicate canapes. I buttoned it up, feeling like a character in a play I hadn't auditioned for, and walked out into the living room. By 6 o'clock, the room was full of men in charcoal suits and women in sharp cocktail dresses. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the sound of artificial, loud laughter. I moved through the crowd with a silver tray, offering stuffed mushrooms and shrimp. I felt invisible, a piece of utility furniture that occasionally offered food. Then I heard a voice I recognized. It was one of Julian's senior partners, a man named Sterling. He was holding a glass of scotch and looking at me with a slight frown. "Julian," Sterling called out, his voice booming over the soft jazz music. "Is that your wife's father? I thought I saw a family photo in the hallway when I arrived." My heart stopped for a moment. This was it. This was the moment Julian could claim me. He could say, "Yes, that's Elias Vance. He built the very foundations of this city. He's the reason we have this house." He could have given me back my dignity with a single sentence. Instead, Julian laughed. A nervous, high-pitched sound that set my teeth on edge. "Oh no, Sterling. That's just Eli. He's an old gardener we used to employ. He fell on some hard times and got a bit confused in his old age. We let him stay here and help out around the house. It's a charity thing, really. You know how Maya is with strays." Sterling nodded, looking at me with a mixture of pity and mild disgust. "That's very noble of you, Julian. Very noble indeed." I stood there, the silver tray trembling just slightly in my hand. An old gardener, a stray, a charity case. I looked across the room and found Maya. She was standing by the fireplace, holding a glass of white wine. She was looking right at us. She heard him call her father a stray. She took a slow sip of her wine and then turned her back to us, engaging in conversation with another guest. She turned her back. I walked to the sidebar to refill a decanter of red wine. My hands were shaking, but not from age. It was a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. As the dark liquid poured into the crystal, my mind drifted back 30 years. I remembered this land when it was nothing but red clay and thick pine forest. I bought this lot with cash I saved from working double shifts at the quarry. I cleared the trees myself. I remembered the day I poured the foundation in the middle of a July heatwave. I mixed the concrete. I laid the rebar. I smoothed the surface until it was level as a lake. Every beam in this house I framed. Every pipe I plumbed. Every wire I ran. I built this house so my daughter would never know what it was like to be insecure or cold. I built it to be a fortress for my family. And now the man who married my daughter, a man who had never calloused his hands on anything harder than a golf club, was telling strangers that I was a charity case in the very house my sweat had built. He thought he owned this place because he held the keys in his pocket. He forgot that I knew where the main shutoff valves were. I knew which walls were load-bearing. I knew that if you pull the right brick, the whole structure comes down. The sound of shattering glass snapped me back to the present. I had turned from the bar with a fresh bottle in my hand. A guest, one of Julian's younger colleagues, had spun around wildly while telling a joke, his arm flailing. He smacked the bottle right out of my hand. Red wine exploded everywhere. It drenched the white carpet. It splashed across the man's expensive gray suit. It soaked the front of my white service jacket. The music stopped, and the room went dead silent. "You clumsy old fool!" the man shouted, jumping back and brushing at his lapels. "Look what you did. This is Italian wool." I stood there, wine dripping from my chin. It wasn't my fault, he had hit me. But before I could speak, Julian was there. He grabbed me by the shoulder of the jacket and shoved me backward. "Eli, what is wrong with you?" Julian screamed, his face turning a dark, mottled red. "I give you one simple job. One job and you ruin it. Do you know how much this carpet costs? Do you know who this is?" "It was an accident," I said, my voice remaining steady. He turned into me. "Do not talk back to me," Julian hissed. "You are embarrassing me. You are embarrassing this family. Look at this mess." He pointed at the floor, then at his colleague. "Apologize," Julian commanded. "Apologize to him right now." I looked at the man in the gray suit. He was sneering at me, waiting for the help to submit. I looked at Julian, his eyes bulging with a sense of unearned entitlement. I looked for Maya. She was still by the fireplace, staring at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. The silence stretched out. I could feel the eyes of every person in the room on me. The old gardener, the charity case, the clumsy servant. I took a deep breath. I felt the weight of 40 years of hard labor in my shoulders. I felt the dignity of a man who had built skyscrapers. And then I buried it all. I lowered my head. I slumped my shoulders. I let myself become the small, defeated old man they wanted to see. "I am sorry, sir," I mumbled, staring at the wine stain on the carpet. "I am very sorry. I am getting old. My hands shake. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Julian let out a scoff of pure disgust. "Get a towel, Eli. Clean this up and then get out of my sight. Go back to the basement." I got down on my knees. I took a rag from my pocket and began to dab at the red stain on the white carpet. The guests turned back to their conversations, the tension breaking into laughter and whispers about the hazards of hiring cheap help. But as I scrubbed that carpet, I wasn't thinking about the wine. I was doing math. I added the cost of the Italian suit to the ledger in my mind. I added the cost of the white carpet. I added the price of the wine. And then I added the price of my dignity. Julian thought he had just put a servant in his place. He didn't realize he had just handed the demolition orders to the foreman. I finished cleaning the spot, stood up, and walked toward the basement door with my head bowed. I did not look at Maya. I didn't need to. She had made her choice when she turned her back. I closed the basement door behind me and locked it. I took off the wine-stained jacket and threw it in the trash. I sat down on my cot and pulled out my notebook. Day 9. The humiliation was complete. Now the eviction could truly begin. 8 days before the harvest festival, the house sat in a silence so deep it felt heavy. Julian had left for the city in his leased BMW, projecting the image of a titan of industry, while Maya had gone to her part-time job at a high-end boutique. They thought they had left the house empty, save for the old man in the basement. They forgot that the old man built the walls they were hiding behind. I waited until the electric hum of the garage door motor faded completely. Then I walked up the basement stairs, my boots heavy on the wood I had sanded and stained myself 20 years ago. I headed straight for the one room that was strictly off-limits, Julian's home office. The door was locked, of course, a standard interior privacy lock. To a man who has installed bank vaults and reinforced steel doors, a privacy lock is a joke. I pulled a thin tension wrench and a pick from my pocket. Took me 4 seconds. The mechanism clicked, a soft surrender in the quiet hallway. I turned the knob and stepped inside. The room smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Papers were scattered everywhere, piles of unopened envelopes accumulating like snowdrifts on the mahogany desk. This was not the workspace of a successful broker. This was the bunker of a man under siege. I sat in his leather chair. It squeaked under my weight. I did not touch the computer. Men like Julian put their public lives on screens, but they hide their shame in paper. They hide the things they cannot delete in the bottom drawers. I went straight for the filing cabinet locked. I popped it open with the same ease as the door and started flipping through the files. In construction, numbers do not lie. If the load-bearing capacity is 10 tons and you put 11 on it, the building collapses. It is simple physics. I wanted to know the physics of Julian's life. I found the tax returns first. They were dismal. He hadn't made a commission in 6 months. Then I found the credit card statements, maxed out. Visa, MasterCard, Amex. He was juggling balance transfers like a circus performer, but those were just cracks in the drywall. I was looking for the structural failure. Then I found it. Tucked in the back of the bottom drawer, inside a plain manila envelope with no label, I pulled out a thick stack of documents. My hands, usually steady as stone, trembled slightly as I read the cover page. It was a loan agreement, but not from a bank. It was from a private equity firm with an address in a strip mall, a predatory lender. I turned the page and saw the number, $400,000. I kept reading. The money had been borrowed 6 months ago. The collateral was listed clearly. My house. The house I held the deed to. The house I had let them live in so they could save capital. I flipped to the signature page. My heart hammered against my ribs like a sledgehammer. There at the bottom was a signature, Elias Vance. It was my name, but it was not my hand. The loops were too wide. The pressure was too light. It was a forgery. A clumsy, desperate forgery made by a man who thought I was too old and too stupid to ever check the registry of deeds. The picture snapped into focus with terrifying clarity. Julian had gambled everything on cryptocurrency. I saw the trading printouts underneath the loan documents, red ink everywhere. He had lost it all. He had forged my signature to leverage my home to cover his losses, hoping for a market rebound that never came. Now the deadline was looming. The full principal plus interest was due in full on the day after the harvest festival. If he didn't pay, the sharks would come for the house. That was why his parents were coming. He wasn't hosting them to brag. He was hosting them to beg for a bailout. And he needed me gone because if his wealthy father saw a confused old man in the basement, he might ask questions. If he saw the true owner of the house, the lies would crumble. They were not just kicking me out because they were ashamed of me. They were kicking me out because they had already sold me down the river. They needed the house empty so they could either refinance or hand the keys over to the loan sharks without me putting up a fight. I stared at the forged signature. It was a crime, a felony, identity theft, mortgage fraud. I took out my phone and snapped clear, high-resolution photos of every page. The loan amount, the address, the forgery, the losses. I documented the ruin of Julian's life page by page. Suddenly, the rumble of the garage door opening vibrated through the floorboards. Maya was home hours early. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I had seconds. I couldn't be found sitting at his desk holding the evidence of his crime. If they knew I knew, they might do something drastic. Desperate men do dangerous things. I shoved the papers back into the envelope and threw it into the back of the drawer. I kicked the drawer shut, grabbed a microfiber cloth from the bookshelf, and started wiping the surface of the desk. Footsteps pounded up the stairs. Fast, angry. The door to the office flew open. Maya stood there still in her coat, her eyes wide with shock and instant fury. She saw me standing by Julian's desk, a rag in my hand. "Dad!" she screamed. "What are you doing in here?" I hunched my shoulders. I let my mouth hang open slightly. I put on the mask of the confused old man. I was looking for the newspaper, Maya," I stammered, wiping a corner of the desk. "And it was dusty in here. I thought I would clean up for Julian. He likes things clean." Maya marched across the room and snatched the cloth from my hand. "You are not supposed to be in here," she hissed. "Julian has told you 1,000 times. This is his private office. You are not to touch his things. You are prying. You are a nosy, senile old man." She pushed me toward the door. Her hands were rough. This was the girl I used to carry on my shoulders to parades. This was the girl whose scraped knees I bandaged. Now she was shoving me out of a room to protect the husband who was bankrupting us both. "I am sorry, baby," I muttered, shuffling my feet. I just wanted to help. I forgot. You always forget, she snapped. Get downstairs. Stay in the basement until dinner. I cannot deal with you right now. I walked to the door, keeping my head down. I let her see a broken, confused father. But as I turned the corner to the stairs, my eyes were dry and clear. I felt the weight of the phone in my pocket. I had the photos. I had the proof. She called me a nosy old man. She was right. I was nosy, and I had just found the bomb that was going to blow their world apart. I walked down the basement stairs, descending back into the dark. But the darkness didn't bother me anymore. I sat on my cot and looked at the photos on my screen. For $100,000. I knew the schedule now. I knew the stakes, and I knew exactly how to bring the whole structure down on top of their heads. Day 8. The reconnaissance was over. It was time to call the demolition crew. 7 days before the Harvest Festival, I stopped being a victim and started being a foreman again. I spent the morning in the basement with a burner phone I'd bought months ago for emergency supplies. My first call wasn't to a lawyer, but to an old friend from the trade, a man named Silas who specialized in high-end real estate and private debt. Elias? You old dog. I haven't heard from you since we finished that hotel in Midtown, Silas said, his voice like gravel. Silas, I need a favor. A big one. I need you to find out who holds the private note on a property in the Heights. I gave him the address. My address. Give me an hour, he said. While I waited, I didn't sit idle. I knew that Julian and Maya were planning to move me to Oak Haven on Monday. That gave me 4 days to move the pieces on the board. I went to the storage locker I kept across town, the one they didn't know about. Inside wasn't just old tools. It was the backup of my life. I found the original deed to the house. I had put it in Maya's name as a gift 5 years ago, but I'd been smart. I had included a life estate clause in the fine print. It meant that as long as I was breathing, the house was mine to live in, and any sale or lien placed on the property without my notarized consent was legally void. Julian's forgery wasn't just a crime. It was a structural failure that made his entire loan a house of cards. My phone buzzed. It was Silas. Elias, you're in trouble. The note is held by a group called Apex Holdings. They aren't banks, Eli. They're vultures. They lent $400,000 against a $1.2 million house. They're praying for a default so they can seize the equity. And the payment is due in full by Friday at 5 p.m. Thanks, Silas. One more thing. Who is Julian trying to sell his new fund to? A man named Mr. Sterling and his associates. They're the big fish in the pond. If they bite, Julian is a made man. If they don't, he's shark bait. I hung up and smiled. Julian was trying to play a game of high-stakes poker with a hand full of jokers. He needed his parents and Sterling to believe he was a success so they would give him the money to pay off Apex. He was using me as the sacrificial lamb to keep his image clean. Upstairs, I heard Maya shouting. I climbed the stairs to find her in the kitchen, surrounded by catering brochures. She looked frayed, her hair messy and her eyes red. Dad, why haven't you finished the guest room? She barked. The Whitmores are coming in 3 days. The baseboards are still dusty. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just nodded. I'll get right on it, Maya. I was just feeling a bit dizzy. My head has been cloudy. She softened for a split second, a flicker of the daughter I used to know appearing in her eyes. But then she glanced at a luxury magazine on the counter and her face hardened again. Just do it, okay? We need this to be perfect. Everything depends on this festival dinner. I understand, I said. Everything. I spent the next several hours cleaning the guest room. But while I was in there, I wasn't just dusting. I was making small, invisible adjustments. I loosened the bracket on the heavy mahogany headboard just enough so that a slight lean would cause it to creak like an old ship. I adjusted the thermostat calibration so the room would stay a chilly 62 degrees no matter what the dial said. Then I went to the laundry room. I took Julian's favorite silk shirts, the ones he planned to wear for the meetings with the investors, and I washed them. But I didn't use detergent. I used a specific industrial stiffening agent I'd kept from my days of treating canvas. When they dried, they would look perfect, but the moment they touched human skin and body heat, they would become as itchy and abrasive as a wool blanket in a desert. I was building a series of small, irritating stressors. I wanted Julian and Maya on edge. I wanted them sleep-deprived and agitated. A stressed person makes mistakes. A stressed person snaps. And I needed them to snap at exactly the right moment. That evening, I saw Julian coming up the driveway. He didn't see me watching from the darkened window of the guest room. He looked terrible. His suit was wrinkled, and he was talking animatedly into his phone. His face twisted in a mask of fear. "I told you I'll have the money," he yelled, though the windows were rolled up. "The festival dinner is the closing. Just give me until Friday." He slammed his hand against the steering wheel. He was cracking. I went back down to the basement and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I began to write a letter. It wasn't a letter to Maya or Julian. It was a letter to the Whitmores, Julian's wealthy, status-obsessed parents. I wrote it in the hand of a concerned neighbor, detailing the unfortunate mental decline of their son-in-law's father and how the young couple was struggling to keep the house from foreclosure. I didn't mail it. Not yet. I just tucked it into my pocket. As I lay on my cot that night, I could hear them arguing upstairs. The floorboards groaned. They were fighting about money, about me, and about the image they were so desperate to maintain. "He's a liability, Maya," Julian shouted. "If your father says one weird thing to Sterling, the deal is dead. I'm moving the Oak Haven intake to Monday morning. No more delays." "Fine," Maya screamed back. "Just make sure the room looks right for your mother." I closed my eyes. They were planning to kidnap me, essentially. They were going to drive me to a facility under false pretenses and leave me there. I felt a cold, hard stone settle in my gut. Any lingering hope that they would change their minds was gone. The structure was rotten to the core. Couldn't be repaired. It had to be raised. I reached out and touched the stone wall of the basement, the wall I had built with my own hands 30 years ago. "Don't worry," I whispered to the house. "We're going to get it back." 5 days before the Harvest Festival, the psychological warfare in the house moved from whispers in the hallway to a direct assault on my reality in the kitchen. I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon, scents that should have signaled a warm family morning. But in this house, they were the opening notes of a calculated performance. I walked into the kitchen wearing my flannel pajamas, shuffling my feet and letting my shoulders hunch just enough to play the part they expected. Julian was leaning against the granite island, holding his smartphone casually. I noticed the camera lens was pointed directly at me. Maya was at the stove, her back rigid as she flipped bacon. "Good morning, Eli," Julian said, his voice dripping with a fake, loud cheerfulness. "Did you sleep well? Do you know what day it is?" I ignored his patronizing tone and went to the cabinet where I kept my heart medication. I reached for the orange bottle that had sat on the second shelf for years. My hand grasped nothing but air. I blinked and felt around, moving spice jars. The shelf was empty. "Maya, have you seen my pills?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "I put them right here yesterday." Maya turned around, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She refused to meet my eyes. "Dad, we talked about this," she said, her voice tight with artificial concern. "You finished that bottle 3 days ago. You threw it out. Don't you remember?" I stared at her. I had refilled that prescription on Monday. The bottle should have been full. I realized then that they weren't just gaslighting me for the sake of it. They were creating a record. Julian was filming, hoping to capture a moment of me looking confused and forgetful, to justify my commitment to Oak Haven. "I must have forgotten," I mumbled, looking at the floor. I saw Julian's thumb tap the screen, likely stopping the recording. "It's okay, Eli," Julian said, stepping closer and patting me on the shoulder. His touch felt like a snake crawling over my skin. "That's why we're going to the doctor on Monday, to help with these little slips. We just want you to be safe." I nodded like a submissive child and retreated back to the basement. The moment the door clicked shut, the fog of confusion vanished from my eyes. I pulled out my burner phone and checked the time. It was 9 a.m. I called Arthur Thorne, my attorney and the only man who knew the full extent of my holdings. Arthur wasn't just a lawyer. He was a shark I had kept on retainer for 30 years. Roosevelt, Arthur answered, using the middle name I only used for business. The paperwork is ready. We've confirmed the ownership structure of the Falcon Development Group. You still hold the controlling interest. Good, I said. I want to activate the sunset clause on the Maple Drive property. I'm selling the house, Arthur. Today. To who? Arthur asked, though I think he already knew the answer. To Falcon, I replied. I'm selling it to my own company for market value. I want the deed transferred by noon, and I want an immediate eviction and demolition order attached to the sale. I want the house leveled. There was a long silence on the other end. Your daughter lives there, Elias. If you do this, they'll be on the street by the festival. They already put me in a basement, Arthur. They already forged my name to steal the equity. They are planning to dump me in a warehouse for the indigent on Monday. I'm not destroying a home. I'm clearing a site of structural rot. Understood? Arthur said, his voice shifting into a professional coldness. I'll have the digital signatures ready within the hour. What about the demo crew? Book them for the day of the festival, I said. Noon sharp. I want the first hammer to strike while they're sitting down for their expensive dinner. I hung up and sat on my cot, surrounded by the scent of mildew. My children thought I was a burden they could discard. They thought my hands, rough from years of pouring concrete and framing houses, were only good for fixing their leaks. They forgot that the man who knows how to build a house is the only one who knows exactly where to place the charges to bring it down. I spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet preparation. I didn't pack a suitcase, that would look suspicious. Instead, I began moving my most precious items, my wife Beatrice's jewelry, our old photo albums, and my original journeyman's license, into a small toolbox. I hid it behind a loose stone in the basement wall I had built myself 30 years ago. That evening, I was summoned upstairs for a final family meeting. The house was already being transformed for the festival. Expensive linens were draped over the tables, and the scent of imported lilies filled the air. Julian and Maya sat me down in the living room. Dad, Maya started, her voice trembling slightly. I think a small part of her soul was still fighting, but the greed in her eyes was winning. We've made a decision. For your health, we're going to take you to a special retreat on Monday. Just for a few weeks, to get your strength back. Oak Haven, I asked, keeping my voice frail. It's a top-tier facility, Julian lied, not even flinching. They have the best staff. You'll have a private room. It's what you need, Eli. We've already signed the papers. I looked at the mahogany table, the one Julian had lied about me scarring. I looked at the walls I had framed. I looked at my daughter, who was choosing a liar over her father. If you think it's best, I whispered. Julian beamed. He looked like he had just closed the biggest deal of his life. He didn't realize he had just signed his own eviction notice. That's the spirit, Julian said, standing up. Maya, let's go get that vintage wine from the cellar. We should celebrate. To new beginnings. I watched them walk away, hand in hand, celebrating the successful disposal of a human being. I went back to my basement and pulled out the burner phone. I sent a one-word text to Arthur Thorne. Proceed. The trap was set. They were planning a festival. I was planning a demolition. And by the time the harvest moon rose, they would find out that you should never underestimate a man who knows how to read the blueprints of your life. For days before the harvest festival, the house had transformed into a staging ground for a performance. Julian was manic, pacing the hallways in his stiffened silk shirts, scratching at his neck while barking orders into his headset. Maya was a whirlwind of expensive floral arrangements and catering menus, her eyes darting around as if she were looking for a ghost. They had no idea that the man they were treating like a ghost had already moved the ground beneath their feet. I spent my morning in the basement, finishing the final preparations for my departure. Using a heavy-duty masonry drill muffled by a thick moving blanket, I bored 4 small holes into the structural wooden beams that supported the center of the house. I wasn't going to blow the house up. I'm a builder, not a criminal. but I was going to ensure it was legally and physically uninhabitable by the time the festival reached its peak. I took the photos I'd taken of Julian's forged signatures and the predatory loan documents and printed them out at a local library. I placed them into a thick, cream-colored envelope. On the front, I wrote in my best calligraphy, "For the Whitmores, the truth about your investment." I also prepared a second envelope for the Apex Holdings loan sharks. It contained a copy of my deed with the life estate clause highlighted in bright yellow, along with a formal cease and desist from Arthur Thorne's law firm. It informed them that the $400,000 loan Julian took out was secured against a property he didn't legally own, making their contract null, void, and a matter for the district attorney. I was cutting the oxygen to Julian's fire. When I returned to the house, the atmosphere was suffocating. The Whitmores, Julian's parents, had arrived early. They were tall, brittle people who smelled of expensive gin and old money. "Elias," Mr. Whitmore said, nodding at me as if I were a particularly dull museum exhibit. "I see you're still keeping busy in the cellar. Someone has to keep the pipes from bursting, Harrison," I said, offering a tight smile. "It's an old foundation. You have to know which cracks to fill and which ones to let breathe." Julian let out a forced, nervous laugh and stepped between us. "Eli gets a bit philosophical about the plumbing, Dad. Don't mind him. Why don't we go to the sunroom? Maya has some aged cheddar and a 2018 Cabernet waiting." As they walked away, I saw Julian's neck was beet red from the itchy shirt I'd prepared. He was sweating despite the 62-degree temperature I'd locked into the guest wing. He looked like a man walking a tightrope in a gale. That night, the house was full of the sounds of the elite. Laughter echoed through the vents. I sat in the dark basement, listening to the footsteps above. I heard Maya and Julian in the kitchen, their voices hushed but frantic. "The room is freezing, Maya," Julian hissed. "My mother had to sleep in her fur coat. And why is the headboard banging against the wall every time someone moves? It sounds like the house is falling apart." "I don't know," Maya cried. "I checked the thermostat, and it's set to 72, but the air is ice cold, and Dad is being weird. He just stares at me." "3 more days," Julian whispered. 3 more days and he's at Oak Haven. We'll sell the house, pay off the bridge loan, and we'll never have to deal with his character again. Just hold it together. I reached into my toolbox and pulled out a small, remote-controlled water valve I'd installed on the main line earlier that day. With a single tap on my phone, I restricted the water flow to the upper floors to a mere trickle. The scream from the master bathroom told me the luxury shower had just turned into a pathetic, freezing drip. I lay back on my cot. I felt no guilt. They had already stolen my name. They had already tried to steal my future. I was simply returning the favor. In the silence of the basement, I thought about the house I'd built. I thought about the first night Beatrice and I had slept here on a mattress on the floor, dreaming of the life we would build for Maya. That life was gone. The girl who used to help me plant the garden was buried under layers of greed and Julian's shallow ambitions. I wasn't just destroying a house. I was performing a mercy killing on a memory that had turned into a nightmare. Tomorrow was the day before the festival. The day the inspectors would arrive. The day the first cracks would become visible to the world. I checked my burner phone. A message from Arthur Thorne. "The Falcon Development Group has finalized the purchase. You are now technically a tenant in a building marked for immediate structural remediation. The eviction notices are printed." I smiled. "Happy harvest," I whispered to the dark. 3 days before the festival, the pressure reached its boiling point. The Whitmores were complaining about the rustic plumbing. Julian was scratching his skin raw from the treated shirts, and Maya was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The morning started with a loud banging on the front door. I was upstairs, playing the part of the helpful handyman, when 2 men in neon vests appeared. They weren't plumbers or caterers. They were city building inspectors. "Can I help you?" Julian asked, stepping onto the porch, his voice high and defensive. "We received an anonymous tip regarding structural instability and illegal modifications to the primary load-bearing supports," the lead inspector said, holding a clipboard. "We're here for a mandatory safety sweep." Julian turned pale. That's impossible. This house is a fortress. We'll be the judge of that, the inspector replied, brushing past him. I stayed in the background, a shadow in the hallway. I had, of course, been the one to call in the tip. The small holes I'd bored into the beams weren't enough to make the house fall, but they were more than enough to trigger a notice of violation. The inspectors spent 2 hours in the basement. When they came up, they didn't look happy. They looked at Julian with the kind of stern authority usually reserved for criminals. This basement has been modified without permits, the lead inspector stated. There are holes in the main supports. Until a certified engineer signs off on a remediation plan, this structure is flagged. We're issuing a yellow tag. No more than 4 people are allowed in the building at any time for safety reasons. 4 people, Maya shrieked from the kitchen. We have 20 guests coming for the harvest dinner. Julian's parents are here. His investors are coming. Then you better find a restaurant, the inspector said, handing Julian a bright yellow document. If we catch a crowd in here, the fines start at $5,000 an hour. Have a nice day. Julian slammed the door so hard the crystal in the cabinet rattled. He turned on Maya, his face purple. This is him. This is your father's doing. He's been down there for weeks. He must have messed with the beams to spite us. Maya looked at me, her eyes filling with a mixture of fear and realization. Dad? Did you do this? I put on my best look of blank confusion. Do what, honey? I was just trying to hang a shelf for my tools. I might have used the wrong drill bit. My eyes aren't what they used to be. You senile old fool. Julian roared, lunging toward me. He stopped just short of physical contact, his hands shaking. You've ruined everything. Do you know who is coming to that dinner? Sterling, the man who controls my entire future. If I tell him we can't host because the house is unstable, I'll be the laughingstock of the firm. Maybe we can just not tell them? Maya whispered. The neighbors saw the city truck, Maya. This is the Heights. Gossip is the local currency. Julian began pacing, his fingers digging into his scalp. We have to fix this. We'll move the dinner to Friday. We'll tell everyone it's a structural renovation to add a wine cellar. And Monday morning at 8 a.m., he is going to Oak Haven. I don't care if I have to drag him there in zip ties. I retreated to the basement, but I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a general. The yellow tag was the first wall to fall. The second wall was Julian's pride. I pulled out my burner phone and checked the news. The local business journal had just posted a small blurb about a major shakeup at Julian's firm. Rumors were swirling that his department was being audited for irregularities. My anonymous tip to the firm's compliance officer about Julian's forged loan was starting to bear fruit. But the real strike was yet to come. I took the envelope addressed to the Whitmores and placed it inside the guest room's nightstand, tucked under the welcome folder Maya had so carefully prepared. It contained the proof of Julian's $400,000 debt and the photos of his forged signature. I then went to the kitchen. Everyone was in the sunroom arguing. I took the master key to the house, the one I'd kept since the day I finished the construction, and I walked out the back door. I drove to a nearby storage facility where I had a small, climate-controlled unit. Inside was something I hadn't looked at in years. A heavy, black ledger. It was the original record of every cent I had spent building the house on Maple Drive. It contained the receipts for the lumber, the concrete, the electrical, and most importantly, the original notarized deed of gift that included the life estate clause. I sat in my truck and looked at the sunset. The sky was a bruised purple, the same color as the marks Julian's words had left on my spirit. They thought they were the masters of this domain. They thought they could move me like a piece of unwanted furniture. They were about to learn that you can't build a palace on a foundation of lies and expect it to stand when the architect decides to withdraw his support. I called Arthur Thorne one last time. Is the crew ready for Friday? They're on standby, Elias. The heavy machinery will be in the neighborhood by 10 a.m. The eviction notices will be served at noon. Good, I said. Tell them to start with the sunroom. It's where they keep the expensive wine. I drove back to the house, parked my truck, and walked back into my basement. I was a tenant in my own home, waiting for the final act to begin. 2 days until the festival. 2 days until the end. 1 day before the festival, the house was a powder keg. Julian was a ghost of a man. His skin raw and red from the itchy shirts. His eyes darting to every corner of the ceiling as if expecting the roof to cave in. The yellow tag from the city was taped to the front door, a bright, mocking reminder of his failure. I spent the day moving. Not in a way they noticed, but with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent 40 years on job sites. I moved my toolbox, my wife's pictures, and my original journals to my truck. I did it while Julian was screaming at his firm's compliance officer on the phone, and while Maya was frantically trying to move the forbidden dinner party to a local country club, only to find that Julian's credit cards were being declined one by one. By evening, the Whitmores had found the envelope I left in the guest room. I heard the explosion from the basement. $400,000, Julian? Harrison Whitmore's voice boomed, shaking the floorboards. To a predatory lender? And you used this house, as collateral? The house that belongs to Elias. Dad, I can explain. Julian's voice was thin, desperate. Explain what? That you forged your father-in-law's signature. Mrs. Whitmore's voice was like ice. We are leaving, Julian. We will not be party to a felony. And don't bother calling our attorney. We're calling our own. The front door slammed. 2 minutes later, I heard their rental car peel out of the driveway. That night, for the first time in months, I didn't stay in the basement. I walked upstairs. The house was eerie, half-decorated for a festival that would never happen. Julian was slumped on the velvet sofa, a bottle of expensive bourbon in his hand. Maya was sitting at the kitchen island, crying silently. I didn't say a word. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and looked at my daughter. The doctor's appointment is tomorrow morning, Dad, she whispered, her voice hollow. She didn't even look up. Julian says we have to go through with it. We have no money left. If we get you into Oak Haven, he thinks he can sue for control of your remaining assets to pay off the debt. She was telling me the plan. Even now, at the edge of the abyss, she was choosing the man who had destroyed our family. I know, Maya, I said softly, but plans change. I went back downstairs and slept like a baby. I knew that at dawn, the demolition of their world would begin. Friday morning, the day of the festival, arrived with a cold, gray light. At 8 a.m., Julian and Maya were at the basement door. Get your things, Eli, Julian said. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. We're going to the retreat now. We're leaving early to beat the traffic. I came up the stairs, but I wasn't carrying a suitcase. I was carrying my legal folder and my burner phone. I'm not going to Oak Haven, Julian, I said, standing tall. My voice was no longer frail. It was the voice of the foreman who had commanded crews of 50 men. You don't have a choice. Julian lunged for my arm, but I stepped back and held up the phone. The police are already on their way, Julian. Not for me. For the man who forged a signature on a $400,000 lien. I've already sent the digital copies to the district attorney. And Maya, I turned to her. I've filed the life estate injunction. This house cannot be sold, mortgaged, or lived in by anyone but me. Maya gasped, her face turning white. Dad, you can't. I already did, I said. Just then, a heavy rumble vibrated through the ground. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of a Mack truck and a yellow excavator pulling up to the curb. My crew had arrived. What is that? Julian ran to the window. That is the demolition crew, I said. I sold this house to my development company yesterday, and since the city has already declared it structurally unsound thanks to my accidental drilling, I've ordered an immediate teardown for safety reasons. The eviction notices were posted on the door 10 minutes ago by a process server. You're destroying the house? Maya screamed. Our home. It was never your home, Maya, I said, my heart feeling like a cold stone. It was a gift you tried to turn into a prison. I'm just reclaiming the materials. The front door opened, and Arthur Thorne walked in, followed by 2 uniformed officers. Julian Vance? The officer asked. You're under investigation for identity theft and mortgage fraud. You need to come with us. As they led a sobbing Julian out in handcuffs, I walked out onto the porch. The neighborhood was quiet, the harvest sun just beginning to warm the air. I looked at the excavator. The operator looked at me, waiting for the signal. Maya stood on the lawn, her life's belongings in 2 small suitcases she'd managed to grab. She looked at me, her eyes begging for mercy. "Where am I supposed to go, Dad?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment I saw the little girl I had built this world for. But then I remembered the basement. I remembered the itchy jacket. I remembered the plan to dump me in Oak Haven. "I hear Oak Haven has an opening," I said. I turned to the foreman and gave a single, sharp nod. The excavator's engine roared to life, and the great metal claw swung toward the sunroom, the room where they had planned to sell my soul for a commission. The wood splintered, the glass shattered. The foundation I had poured 30 years ago groaned as the weight was lifted. The dust of the sunroom was still settling in the air when I walked away from the wreckage. I didn't look back at the splintering wood or the shattered glass. I didn't look back at Maya, who was sitting on the curb with her head in her hands. I simply walked to my truck, climbed into the cab, and drove. I drove until the suburbs turned into city, and the city turned into open highway. I pulled into the parking lot of a small, quiet diner miles away from the chaos on Maple Drive. I ordered a black coffee and a slice of apple pie. For the first time in years, the food didn't taste like ashes. As I ate, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Arthur Thorne. "The site is secure. The demolition of the primary structure is 60% complete. Julian is being processed at the county jail. Maya has been informed that the Falcon Group will not be pursuing charges against her personally, provided she signs the non-disclosure and non-interference agreements." I set the phone down. I felt a strange mixture of lightness and a deep, hollow silence. I had won, but victory in a family war is a lonely thing. I had lost a daughter long before I tore down the house, but today, I had finally buried the ghost of the man I used to be, the man who let himself be treated like clutter. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the original deed, now stamped and finalized. I also pulled out the small photo of my wife, Beatrice, that I'd saved from the basement. "It's done, B," I whispered. "The house is gone, but the ground is clean again." I paid my tab and walked back out to my truck. I didn't go back to the heights. I drove to the marina where my small, meticulously maintained fishing boat was docked. I spent the afternoon loading my tools and my few remaining boxes onto the deck. I had enough in my private accounts to live anywhere in the world, but for now, the open water felt like the only place that wasn't built on a lie. As the sun began to set, casting a long, golden glow over the harbor, I untied the lines. I started the engine, a sound far more honest than any conversation I'd had in that house for a decade. I looked at the skyline of the city I had helped build. From this distance, you couldn't see the cracks in the foundations or the rot in the walls. You could only see the lights. I realized then that a building is just stone and wood. The real structure of a life is made of the respect you give yourself. I pushed the throttle forward. I was done fixing things for people who didn't appreciate the work. I was done being a ghost in a palace of my own making. I was Elias Vance, a master builder, and I still had plenty of time to start a new project. They say blood is thicker than water, but I learned that greed is an acid that can dissolve even the strongest bonds. My daughter and her husband made the fatal mistake of valuing my net worth over my self-worth. They saw an old man and assumed he was a ruin. They forgot that the architect is the only one who knows how to clear the site for something better. The lesson is simple. Never disrespect the hands that built your world, because those same hands know exactly how to take it back. I steered the boat toward the horizon, the cool salt air filling my lungs. Behind me, the ruins of Maple Drive were already becoming a memory. Ahead of me, there was nothing but the sea and the freedom I had finally earned.